Hello, everyone. Welcome to our continuing series on our voter education forum. This will actually be the last one for West Michigan. We're hoping to be able to put on other ones in different regions where the Climate Witness Project has partners. So stay tuned for that. But we're very excited this evening to have Bryan with us. Bryan is the Democratic nominee for Michigan's 2nd District. And we're excited for him to spend some time with us and engage with us on this very important issue. Again, for those who have joined us for all the other forums we've had, thank you. We are grateful that you are sticking with us on this very important subject. Before we start, there's some housekeeping details, as always, that I want to go through before we sort of turn it over to Bryan. I did want to mention that we have made it a point to invite candidates from candidates for each district across the political aisle. We have Bryan for today. Unfortunately, Representative Heisinger wasn't able to participate in our series this year, but I encourage folks who want to learn more about his climate platform and policies to go on his official website to learn more there. If you're a constituent in his district, I urge you to pick up the phone and call his office and write to him and communicate that indeed people of faith care about this issue. And you would also want to see his response to the urgency of the issue. So that's just a suggestion from me. So again, just how our evening is going to go, we're going to have Bryan introduce himself briefly, and then we're going to have 2 moderated questions for Bryan, and then we really want to hear from you all, you the voters, you our constituents, to really ask your questions for Bryan. So that's sort of the general outline for tonight, but again, we wanted to reaffirm sort of the why we do this. Again, for those who are not familiar with the Climate Witness Project, we are a campaign of the Christian Reformed Church Office of Social Justice and World Renew, and we really engage on the issue of the climate crisis and work alongside congregations, individuals, organizations to really understand how to have a faithful response to the climate crisis in ways of advocacy, education, and other pillars of work. We encourage you to really learn more from us and visit our website if you haven't. Another housekeeping detail is that tomorrow or in the next couple of days, you will receive a follow-up email from us if you signed up with some resource toolkit that we have for you, which includes very valuable information as we head into the election. So just FYI on that. Just wanted to, again, read the very important excerpt from our Synodical mandate, which really guides the work of the Climate Witness Project. The Synod, which is the governing body of the Christian Reformed Church, issued this sort of call to us and mandate, which really sums up in this line, which says, human-induced climate change is an ethical, social justice, and religious issue. And for folks who have joined us in our other forums, we have said that this is a pro-life issue for us as people of faith. And it's not abstract at all for us because this is something that we see the impacts right here happening now, not only on the West Coast, but here in the Midwest and what is unfolding with climate impact. So this is something that we care about. Other quick guidelines as we go through our conversations for this evening. We hope that when we get to the Q&A session, you stay on topic. We really want our comments to be directly related to what we are talking about. We hope your questions are concise and easy to follow. We ask that you ask your questions in polite and respectful tone, even when you strongly disagree. We ask that you refrain from making any derogatory remarks or personal attacks or criticisms about our guests for tonight. And above all, we hope that Your questions and comments do not undermine the ministry of the church. As always, we welcome constructive criticism. But yes, I think, again, trying to just look through my notes here to make sure I've covered everything on that front. Yes. Any questions on that so far before we get started? Again, for those who have been joining us, this is much of a repeat on that, so bear with us, but we want to make sure that we are all on the same page. Great. We'll be transitioning into having Bryan introduce himself, and then we will follow up with our sort of moderated questions and then transition to our Q&A session. So over to you, Bryan. And maybe sing before you start. We're joking.
Keeps trying to get me to sing, but hasn't worked yet. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, friends at the Climate Witness Project, and all of you for joining us. Really great to be with you tonight. My name is Bryan Berghoef. I'm a pastor, a father, husband, and now running to be the representative for Michigan's 2nd Congressional District. I grew up right here in West Michigan, in Coopersville and Sparta. And while I was in college at the University of Michigan that I sort of sensed a calling to ministry, a desire to serve in the community and share my love of God with others. And so that led me to eventually enroll at Calvin Seminary right here in West Michigan in Grand Rapids. And that's where I met my lovely wife, Christy. And we've been married 18 years now, and I've been a pastor for 15 of those years. The first decade plus was in the CRC, and now I'm in the United Church of Christ. And so growing up in West Michigan, I, like so many of us, learned to love and enjoy the natural beauty that's all around us. And that, of course, includes Lake Michigan, but also the lakes, the inland lakes, the forests and the state parks and all of that. As my family growing up, we would often camp right here in West Michigan at those state parks. And really it was, spending time with my family outdoors, going on hikes in the woods, walking along the shore, really being immersed in creation that really created a love of creation for me and helped me, really not just learn in my head about how important it is to care for creation, but to really feel it in my body and in my soul. And so I'm so grateful for those formative experiences. And we've tried to really replicate that with our own family now that we're parents. I have 4 kids, 2 in high school and 2 in middle school. And we love to go camping. We've been at many of the national parks across the country, state parks here locally. And if you ask my kids, the perfect day for the Berghoef kids is a beach day on Lake Michigan. So they really are getting many of the experiences that were so special to me, and we want to instill in them both a sense of awe and also a celebration for what God has made and our responsibility in taking care of it. Some of my other early memories growing up here in West Michigan were in church and always feeling sort of a sense of intimidation and awe walking into the sanctuary with the tall windows and vaulted ceiling and hearing the organ playing. And in that space, I was taught many values that are still core to who I am. Values like decency, integrity, character, compassion. We were taught that honesty was foundational, telling the truth was important. I was taught to love Jesus and to follow Jesus and to do the things that Jesus did. And unsurprisingly, also growing up, I was often taught that the way we express those values politically was in the Republican Party. And so I did for a number of years. And yet it was many of those same values instilled in me at a young age that, taken deeper, have eventually moved me to where now I'm running for office as a Democrat. And I want to be clear that I don't think elections should be about what party you belong to, first and foremost. I think it should be about what values inform your vote and how do the people that you're voting for incarnate or live out those values in their lives. And for me, that means sometimes folks might vote for one party for one office and another party for another, because I think both our parties have plenty of flaws, as we'd all agree. But my journey, which began, in the Republican Party, has moved me now to where I feel more comfortable in the Democratic Party. But I'm certainly also grateful that I have supporters from across the political spectrum. One of the things that being a pastor entails is being a good listener. And I found that running for Congress, that comes in handy because you get to do a lot of listening and you get to talk to a lot of folks. And what I'm hearing from constituents is worry about climate change, worry about clean drinking water, worry about how we're treating the environment. I've marched with students in student-led climate strike marches. I hear from high schoolers who are worried that people my age and older aren't taking climate change seriously enough, that we've been happy to create industries that have had a negative impact on the environment, but we haven't taken responsibility enough to re-envision how industry and the economy can be more sustainable long-term. I hear, as I said, people worried about safe drinking water, worried about threats to our Great Lakes from invasive species, people worried about the Lake Michigan shoreline, rising lake levels, and people worried about the acceleration of climate-related weather patterns and the effects that has across the country and here locally on agriculture and other things. And I agree with the CRC climate change policy in recognizing that it is the near consensus position of the international scientific community that climate change is occurring, and in many ways that is due to human activity, and that therefore climate change is an ethical, social justice, and religious or faith issue. And so I feel we must take immediate and aggressive steps to protect and renew our Great Lakes, to manage the impacts of climate on West Michigan communities, businesses, and ecosystems. Because I think it's not only the right thing to do, I think it's the economically advantageous thing to do. And I think it protects the health and well-being of our families and our communities. And so I firmly believe that with all of you tonight.
Great. Thank you so much, Bryan. Before we get to our questions from Laura, and Laura, please introduce yourself as you begin the questions. But just wanted to contextualize that our first question that we are going to ask would seem very like preaching to the choir for you as a pastor. But it's very important. I think that's something that we've been asking all our candidates, because I think it's very foundational to our organization and the work we do, especially because I think people of faith get a bad rap when it comes to the issue of climate. And we really want to change the narrative. We really want to change and I think reclaim the narrative that we have a moral, compelling obligation to care for creation. So Laura will ask those questions, but I think you could give a whole sermon on the first question as a pastor, but I would say that when I see you're going there, I'll pass around the offertory and the offering bowl when you do that. But just to say that we know you could give a whole sermon on that particular question, but we want to ask that nonetheless, so then our folks know that this is very foundational. And I think the point that we keep saying back to back is that people of faith have a unique place in this conversation to really inch us closer to climate justice. So over to you, Laura.
Thank you, Andrew. Hi, everyone. I'm Laura. I'm also part of the CWP leadership. And we do have two questions that the first one Andrew has prefaced very nicely, which is, Bryan, how does your faith shape your views on the climate crisis?
Yeah, thank you, Laura. Yeah, one of the things that was a tension for me on this was that I was hearing, in church and so forth about, God creating everything and our need to be stewards of it. But then when it came to voting, we were sort of told, well, but that's actually a liberal thing. That's not something that matters to us as people who vote Republican. And that was one of the tensions that, was a part of my journey politically and spiritually. And Psalm 24 tells us that the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. And the scriptures tell us that God created the earth, the lakes, the rivers, the streams, the animals, the mountains, and God declared it good. And those same scriptures tell us that then God created humanity in God's image and called it very good. And the first task was, or one of the first things was to set the first humans into a garden to care for it, to work it, to manage it, to make use of it, but all in a way that also was also a caretaking, a stewardship. And so my faith tells me that we were created to live in harmony with, not in tension against, creation. It also tells me, my faith, that we ourselves are part of the created order. And so care for creation in many ways is a justice issue. We know that industry-related pollution disproportionately harms communities of color and low-income communities. And ultimately, comes back to how we treat ourselves and how we care for our neighbors, because all of creation is so intimately interconnected. And this is something that other traditions and faith traditions have recognized. Chief Seattle, chief of the Duwamish and Suquamish Native peoples, in a famous quote said, "Man or humanity does not weave this web of life. He is merely a strand in it, but whatever he does to the web, he does to himself." And I think that is very much in tune with what I read in the scriptures as well. And the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. said something very similar. He said, in a real sense, all of life is interrelated. All people are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied together in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. This, he said, is the interrelated structure of reality. And I've also been informed in my own faith journey from other faith traditions, such as in Judaism, which talks about the concept, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, of tikkun olam, which is the idea of healing or repair of the world. And that really spells out that there's a responsibility of God's people, of humanity, to change, improve, and heal our surroundings and the creation. And it implies that each of us has an obligation not only to work for the betterment of our own lives, but of the world around us, and knowing that that work will also pay dividends and work for the good of future generations. And as a good CRC kid, I was taught that there are two means by which we know God, the scriptures and creation. And John Calvin invites us. You can't join a CRC-based thing without referencing John Calvin, so bear with me. John Calvin noted that these two ways of knowing God are interconnected, and that the scriptures in a way are like a lens in which we can interpret the natural world around us, which speaks to us of God. And I don't think I'm alone in saying that I never feel more spiritually connected or close to God than when I'm in nature. And so for me, my faith as a Christian very much informs my desire to be a steward of the environment. It reminds me also that the environment and the economy are totally connected, and we have to find a way forward that's good for both. So often we're told, well, we have to either do what's good for the economy or the environment. I think that's a false dichotomy. I think by taking care of the environment seriously, there are good economic gains to be made. And I believe God invites us to be partners in this work that's both good for the world and also, I believe, good for ourselves and our spiritual lives as human beings.
Thank you so much, Bryan. As you were talking, I was like, Chris, Steve, and other folks on the leadership team, we should probably contract Bryan to work on our worship resources. Let me be clear, this is not an endorsement. I just want to be very, very clear, but that's very helpful. I think you really touched at something, and I think what you were saying just references what Catherine Hayhoe has been saying about this conversation, that you don't start with the data, the science, and all that. You start with the heart. And I think what more could be more appropriate than really invoking our faith to start this conversation. So thank you for that.
You bet.
All right, to your second moderated question. With all the climate crises that we're seeing in the U.S. at the moment, with our wildfires in the West and the higher frequency and intensity of our hurricanes, different people have different opinions on levels of government that should come in to kind of help in terms of the climate crisis. But personally, I think the federal government can do a lot of work in overhauling policies and systems that could really make change that is effective and could intervene in time. For yourself, how do you see the federal government in terms of the climate crisis? And if you should be elected, how do you see yourself in that work?
Thank you. It's an important question. As you highlighted, so many things going on in our world that I believe are related to climate change that, are really reminding us, so that we can't forget if we wanted to, how important it is to address this issue. And I think the government certainly does have an important role to play. And I think one of the roles that matters is what was already noted, and that's sort of the heart issue or the narrative issue. And we currently have an administration and a president who calls human-induced climate change a hoax, who will look at the wildfires burning and say, well, the science is probably wrong, and just you wait, it'll cool down and get better on its own. And I don't think that's any way to respond when we have scientifically proven crises on our hands. I think that's proven a failure in response to the current pandemic, public health pandemic that we're going through. The reason this is an online forum, right, and we're not in person together is due to, I think, mishandling of that in part. And I think this administration has failed when it comes to climate change. And we've also seen a continual rollback of environmental regulations, a pulling out or a desire to pull out of the Paris climate agreements. And I think that's irresponsible. And I think, it's worth reminding listeners that I'm facing an opponent who fully supports this administration, who's done nothing to dissuade him of his disbelief in climate change and his negligent approach to care for creation. And I think that's not good enough for a congressional district that's in the Great Lakes state and that has beautiful shoreline from Holland up to Ludington. And so if we don't take climate change seriously, we are betraying future generations. And so I think it's time for the US to be leaders on global climate change and not remain a global embarrassment. And so more specifically, I'm looking forward to working with Republican and Democratic senators and representatives to fight for continued investment in the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative that was introduced back in 2009 to do the important work of, really being sure that we are taking care of the Great Lakes and the restoration of it. In Michigan alone, nearly 900 projects have been funded by the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. And that's been, over $700 million spread over a range of projects and really showing some really positive results. But I think more needs to be done, and we need to be sure that there is sustained funding for the long term. But we've seen in a study of that every dollar of federal spending on the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative produces over $3 worth of additional economic activity in the Great Lakes region. And so, it's worth investing certainly for its own sake, but also worth noting that there's economic gains to be made by investing and caring for our environment. Secondly, I would say that we need to end immediately all federal subsidies and tax incentives for the fossil fuel industry. It seems ludicrous to me that we are giving billions of dollars to subsidize oil corporations and their ability to expand their exploration, extraction, and development of fossil fuels. We often talk in this nation about letting the free market sort of determine results. Well, I think let's do that then when it comes to our energy sources. Why are we gifting the fossil fuel industry with all of these subsidies, which gives them an unfair advantage compared to cleaner sources of energy? And I think we do need to level the playing field by ending those subsidies, let the market determine what kind of energy we really need and what people want to invest in. And in many cases, wind and solar are cheaper than coal and natural gas in many markets. But again, these subsidies sort of tilt things in the wrong direction. And so I think we have to embrace technology and innovation and fund research into these renewable energies and storage of them. We know that there can be challenges when it comes to storing wind and solar, but let's show that we're committed by investing in research and development so that we really can transition as quickly as possible into more renewable sources of energy. And by doing this, we're going to, significantly reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and so on. And the truth is that there's good jobs to be found in moving to a greener economy. There's a new report that notes that smart energy policies and economic development are making Michigan really a growing hub in the clean energy economy. There's over 300 local companies that are accelerating solar and wind power in Michigan, and a number of those are right here in the 2nd Congressional District. And so again, there are jobs to be found in investing in our environment and in clean energy. And I think currently there's over 100,000 clean energy jobs in Michigan, more than any other state in the Midwest, by the way. And a lot of these come from small businesses and so on. And I agree with Joe Biden that we must work to ensure the U.S. achieves 100% clean energy economy and reaches net zero emissions no later than 2050. I also think we need to support common sense regulations that protect our water, our air, our earth, while promoting, again, economic advances. And, we've seen continual rollback of EPA regulations, which has made it easier for companies to not report they're polluting or just pollute, and it doesn't matter because the regulations aren't there to, even if we wanted to hold them accountable. And as I noted early on, a lot of this pollution disproportionately impacts communities of color and poorer communities, making this a deeply, justice issue. And we also know that our ecosystems and our environment is all interconnected. And so when we're polluting, sort of off to the side over here, and we think no one's paying attention and we don't have to report it, we're not being held accountable, that's going to impact all of us because all of creation is interconnected. And so we need to be sure that we have smart but strong regulations when it comes to pollution and holding polluters accountable. And I think we can do that again in a way that's not economically punitive and in fact allows for economic gains and advancement. And I'd also say, that the government can't solve all of our problems. There's also things that we need to do ourselves locally. And I really appreciate the CRC and the Climate Witness Project, your encouragement to individuals and to congregations to look at how can we live more sustainably, as individuals and families in our homes. How can our churches make smarter use of energy and lower our carbon footprint and pollution in our buildings and in our own activities. And so I think all of the things we want the government to encourage us to do, I think we should move toward, and also know that we need individuals in their own homes, in their businesses, to come right alongside and live into a more sustainable future.
Thanks a lot for that response, Bryan. We will be transitioning to our open Q&A session, but thanks for hitting on certain key points. Again, in the vein of trying to reclaim the narrative, we sort of hear that, like you pointed out, that false dichotomy between the environment and the economy. And I think that's something that I personally, speaking for myself as a young person, is particularly heartened to hear that, because I think we keep hearing that it's almost like you're choosing it's this or that, and we need to really change the narrative around that, and that yes, there's green jobs and green economy, and it's growing very much, not only here in the US but globally. That's something that we are seeing. So we're very excited that most candidates we've spoken to so far, I think even across the political aisle, believe that and see that as something that we shouldn't separate. So thanks for saying that. Okay, so we're going to transition to our Q&A session. Again, we really encourage you to raise your questions that you have with Bryan. You can put your question in the chat, or you can unmute yourself, briefly introduce yourself, and ask your question. I see that there's already a question in the chat, but there's one question that was emailed that was asked to some other candidates when we had the forum, but was sent again. And that's talking about sort of how to achieve just climate policies in our very sort of polarized world right now, because like you were saying, we need for the federal government to move for systemic structural policies, we need to work across people, across different political spectrum to be able to achieve that. So the question is, how would you, if you're elected, be able to work with people across the aisle to really move the needle in climate policy? And what are certain examples or experiences that you can offer us for us to be sort of confident that you are positioned to do that well?
Yeah, I think that's important regardless of the issue. You know, our government is set up in a two-party system to be built on bipartisan work. And so we really do need to learn to work together. And I think one of the things that is frustrating to many of us as citizens in this current moment is the level to which we are polarized. And there's been a lack of bipartisanship and willing to work across the aisle. I think we saw it in the outset of the coronavirus pandemic and the passage of the CARES Act, which did provide stimulus money to every American household, which provided small business loans to companies so that they could continue to pay and provide healthcare for their employees, and a desire to really ensure that we were getting personal protective equipment to people working in the healthcare industry. So we know it can happen, right? But it shouldn't take an immediate crisis for that to happen. And now that this thing is stretching on, we see it's challenging to again come together and agree, but we have to. And on this issue in particular, I think we need to, again, create a narrative in which, you know, we see our shared values, because really when we see shared values, then we have somewhere to stand. And I don't think it's hard for any of us across the political spectrum here in West Michigan to not say we don't care about the health of Lake Michigan and the Great Lakes. It's hard for us not to say that we care about protecting our wetlands and our protected areas, and wanting to be sure that we have beautiful, protected natural areas for generations to come, and for our children and their children's children to enjoy, and also recognizing that our economy is going to fall apart if we don't have a healthy natural environment to live in. So I think there's a real foundation that can be had. And then I think we really need to, again, lean into, well, what is the consensus of the scientific community? So this isn't just my personal opinion. This isn't just political spin. This is what people whose job it is, their expertise is in understanding what's happening to our natural world. And when they are telling us that human-induced climate change is a grave threat to our livelihood, we need to take that incredibly serious and not say, well, it's in question, or, well, people on other sides, you know, it's up for debate. It isn't up for debate. It is not up for debate. And we need the media to stop saying that there's two sides to this when there isn't. And so I think it's important that we continue to speak truth and speak facts, and then invite people into that world that's shaped by, you know, as much of a fact-based narrative as possible. But again, there has to be a hard element, because we know that sometimes the facts don't matter when people have already decided their position on something. And so we need to also be as invitational as possible. We need to share stories of impact that has happened to people, whether it's through the negative impacts of industry-related pollution, or the negative impacts of climate change, negative impacts due to wildfires or storms. Let's bring in the human element. Let's bring in stories so that people are moved in here, right? And I think there has to be movement in here before there can be movement out there. And so I think that has to happen for us to create bipartisanship on this issue and any other issue.
Thank you, Bryan. Especially what he said about finding, you know, common ground to really stand on. I think that work in itself needs dedication and people to truly build that ground. There's a question from the chat. Dale and Joan Holst, sorry, I feel like. Asked, are you familiar with carbon fee and dividend as a federal policy? It's currently embodied as HR 763. Sorry.
Yeah, I am familiar with it. It's actually an example of a bipartisan bill. It does have both Republicans and Democrats on board, which I think is a real plus. And it has the goal, as I understand it, of reducing America's carbon emissions by at least 40% in the first decade. So that's certainly fantastic. And I think, you know, what it does is, you know, create accountability, fiscal financial accountability for corporations on their carbon emissions. And we all know that, you know, economic, I don't want to say penalties, but economic requirements are what moves the narrative on this and so many other issues. If there isn't an economic reality around a policy, people are not going to listen to it. And so I think, you know, having a carbon fee for corporations based on their carbon offset or their carbon footprint, I should say, I think is a very important thing to consider, and I think a strong part of this bill. And then what it also seeks to do is take those fees and turn them into dividends for the American people. And so it's a very democratic and sort of, you know, people-based bill, which will, you know, create some kind of at least payoff for people economically, even while holding corporations accountable financially and in terms of their carbon footprint. So I think there's a lot of promise to it. And I think, you know, it wants to preserve current EPA regulations, which we absolutely have to do. So there's a lot I agree with in that bill. So I think that's a great example of the kind of thing that I would look forward to having a voice on in Congress.
Great, thank you. And again, we've heard from other candidates about some of these specific policy asks, and they promise to give a critical look at it when they are in office, and we will be there to make sure you do. I have been telling everyone that we will be holding you all accountable as much as we can, so thanks for that. We have another question in the chat from Jeff, which says, what should we do about the US coal industry? Natural gas and other energy sources are much cleaner and cheaper, but what about the folks currently in this industry? And I think this is a very, very important question. So your response, Bryan.
Yeah, great question, Jeff. I think it really is important that we transition away from reliance on coal as quickly as possible. And I think we need to then look at, well, what are we shifting to? And how are we looking at local communities that'll be directly impacted, and how do we make sure that those local communities are places where we're investing in more renewable energy sources, infrastructure, research, so that there are immediately jobs and job skill training in these more renewable energy industries for those folks, because we don't want to leave communities in ruin because what's been a part of their economic livelihood for decades is suddenly taken away. But at the same time, I don't think we can say, well, there's too many jobs at stake in this industry for us to keep going on it, because we also have to look at the big picture and realize that the health of the entire planet is also at stake. And so I think we really need to make some hard choices there and move away from coal as a source of energy as soon as possible.
Any other question for Bryan in the chat? Again, you can unmute yourself. We hope this is like a fireside chat conversation, so please feel free to unmute, and I was gonna say on camera, but that is so not a word, but turn on your camera and ask your question. We do have some questions that were emailed to us from folks who cannot join us live, but we want to hear your questions now before we ask those other questions.
I could ask a question.
Thanks, Peter.
This is Peter Bogart in Zeeland, Michigan. And I'm wondering, Bryan, even for those of us who accept the reality of climate change, it's a head-spinning phenomenon. And people are afraid that the economy is sort of like pickup sticks. And if you happen to yank out the wrong stick, everything's going to collapse and it'll be a disaster. So I'm wondering, as you think about the intricacies of economy and policy, where do you think we need to start? You know, if you have to pick the first thing to do and then say then there's a second thing and a third thing, what sort of progression do you envision for dealing with this problem?
Yeah, I think I understand your question. As far as, you know, the pickup sticks analogy, which I loved that game as a kid, so thanks for that throwback. You know, I think we've discovered this year, right, that the economy can be both thrown into trouble by something we didn't foresee, but I think we've also seen that Americans are very adaptive and very creative. And we've discovered that when we need more of us to work remotely because it's safer, that actually can happen. And that actually then reduces, you know, carbon emissions from the commutes to and from the office. And that maybe having everybody in the same building all the time is an older model that we can begin to move away from. And so I think this current year is a great example of our resiliency as people and frankly, the economy's resiliency, so that when we're ready to make those hard choices, that there is an entrepreneurial spirit ready to step in and meet the moment and meet the challenge. And so, you know, I think we need to, let's have confidence in ourselves and not say, oh, you know, if we start taking climate too seriously, everything's going to fall apart. I don't think that's really true. And so I think some of the steps I've already outlined, like ending federal subsidies to oil and gas companies, I think that's an immediate step we can take. And then looking at some bills like HR 763, which was just mentioned, which really gets more aggressive on reducing our carbon emissions and has accountability measures in place for companies so that we all know what we're dealing with. We all know what the standards are. We all know what the goals are, and we have some incentive to do it. Like, frankly, that is what it's going to take. And that's, I think, really a place where the federal government has a unique role in our country, is to set those standards, set those marks, but also inspire us and move us forward. And so, you know, I understand the concerns, and they're real concerns, but I also think sometimes it's overinflated, and also the worry is overinflated. And as we noted at the outset, it's a false choice, you know, that we have to choose the environment or the economy. It's a both and. And so I'm ready for us to start doing it.
Great, thank you. Any other question from folks on here? There's an interesting question which was emailed, but again, saving that if there are folks who have questions on here, please feel free to ask.
Hello. You've mentioned about certain communities within the United States that are disproportionately affected by climate change. But we also know that many around the world who have very low impact on climate change are actually really suffering from that. I've seen it a lot in Africa, particularly in Mozambique. So how do you see the US role in a global context?
Yeah, great reminder, Rebecca. Thanks for that question. Yeah, I think we need to be global leaders, and we haven't been on this issue. And I think it of course is more challenging when, you know, our highest elected office has the attitude our current office holder does. And so I think we need to, you know, be sure that we are right there in those Paris agreements, but then also being sure that we are modeling, that we're holding up our end, and we are working toward the goals outlined of reducing our emissions by, you know, whatever the outlined goals are, and pressing further and leveraging all of the ingenuity and the entrepreneurial spirit we have in our nation, which is one of the world's largest economies. So, like, let's be global leaders on this. Let's not be, you know, as I said earlier, global embarrassments, which unfortunately I think we are right now. And I think that's a very serious responsibility. And as I already noted, for me as a person of faith, I believe we have responsibility as people of faith, but also as citizens, not only of the United States, but as global citizens. It's our responsibility to realize that we can have a positive impact on areas around the globe. And by being leaders, I also think it helps restore some of our standing internationally, and it helps people begin to trust our nation again when it comes to issues of conflict and other global engagements.
Thank you. Any other question before I read this really interesting question that was emailed to us? Again, this was sent to us by one of the constituents actually in Holland. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead with the question. So this question is from Alyssa, and Alyssa says, hi, Bryan. I know that with our current occupant of the White House, the bar for experience is low. But what do you have to say to my grandparents who think your opponent has political experience and you don't? What do you have to say to convince them that they need your vote? And this is a very interesting question. Again, this is me reading the question. Please don't infer anything beyond that. I need to be very crystal.
You're off the hook.
On that, exactly. So Bryan, your response to that question?
Sure, it's a fair question. I've gotten that question, how as a pastor, are you qualified to run for this office? I noted at the outset that one of the key parts of being a pastor is listening. And I found that running for office also really requires one to be a good listener. And so I think, having spent 15 years in various communities, walking alongside folks in their lives. And as a pastor, you get to be there with people in very important and milestone parts of their lives, as well as the mundane parts of their lives. So I get to be there in the regular days, but I also get to be there in the special days, such as the birth of a child or a wedding day. And I'm also there when a difficult diagnosis comes or it's time to lay a loved one to rest. And I think those things have really helped shape me in a way that has built care and compassion and empathy. And I think people are looking in this political moment for politicians who have heart, who have compassion, who do have that sense of empathy. And so I think, a number of those experiences have given me that opportunity. And also as a pastor, I work with other leaders in the community, business leaders, nonprofit leaders, community stakeholders, other clergy members, to work together on local issues that are of importance, whether it's on affordable housing or around immigration or around hunger. And it's been a real privilege to work with people from a variety of religious settings, but also political backgrounds, to say, hey, we've got something locally here that we can work on together. Let's do that. And so I have a history of working with people on a number of different levels toward a shared goal. And I think those are things that really equip me to serve as a representative. And you don't have experience as a representative until you're in that job. And the same was true for my opponent as well. And I would also say that something that separates me from my opponent is that I'm not taking any corporate PAC money, any lobbyist special interest money. And my opponent is funded by the fossil fuel industry, which is problematic when you're going to vote on issues that might hold those industries accountable. He takes money from the pharmaceutical industry, from Wall Street banks. Again, makes it very difficult to vote for legislation that's purely good for your constituents when it may conflict with who's funding you to be there. And so I think I'm qualified in that I'm running a campaign that's by, of, and for the people of the 2nd Congressional District. And I don't believe my opponent can say the same.
Thank you for that. We would be relaying that information to Alyssa, and hopefully she's okay with that, and her grandparents are okay with that as well. We have one last question from Peter before we'll get some closing remarks from you, Bryan. But let's see. Okay, I see one other question that came up. So the first one, sort of a follow-up to the question around the role of the federal government, but it says, do you envision specific ways in which Washington can support local government and local initiatives to move away from fossil fuels?
Yeah, absolutely, Peter. I think there are certainly ways, and I think one of those ways is by investing in research and in technology that moves us toward greener energy. And I think making federal grant monies available to local communities who are ready to make that step and make that a part of their local economies, I think that's certainly a very real and tangible way the federal government can come alongside local communities, as well as providing guidelines around building codes, around sustainable construction, around sustainable energy sources. And so all those guidelines that can happen federally can really impact folks locally, and I think can model that those things can and should be happening at the local level. So I think the federal government really should be a partner in the move toward a greener economy and not an obstacle toward it. So I know that's a little bit broad, but again, I think it's that sort of that posture of a commitment toward addressing climate change, caring for our environment, that needs to be in place at the federal level, that I think empowers all of us across the board to move with it in all the ways that some are directly related to the federal government and some are going to simply be an offshoot of that broader posture and attitude that this is a goal, a national goal and a global goal that needs to happen locally as well as nationally.
Mm-hmm. And this last question is kind of tied to what you just talked about, Bryan, but this is more specific sort of ideas you have that could help us relieve our plastic pollution problem, recycling or other alternative materials or ideas. Again, that's something that is a worry. We actually, the Climate Witness Project just finished a sort of screening and discussion on the story of plastics that really talked about plastic pollution. So I think this is an interesting and apt question for you to sort of wrap us out. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, thank you, Dale and Joan. It's really a great question, and I'm not an expert on this issue, but I certainly commit to learning more about it. And I think, again, we want to encourage an informed citizenry, and so encouraging people to have information, have transparency about our industries and where there are problems, to not hide them away, but to lift up ways we can all be more educated citizens, because I believe the more educated citizens we have, the better outcomes we're going to see when it comes to votes, and that leads to better legislation. And so I think you began to answer the question already in terms of, we really do need to look at what are alternative materials that are biodegradable, that are safer, that aren't such a problem when it comes to pollution, that don't break down, that don't take forever to break down and then become very problematic. And again, if you watch, documentaries on the plastic issue, it's so depressing that you almost don't know where to start. And so I think we really do need to invest in alternative materials. We need to ensure that we're making recycling of plastics as doable as possible, and really making the use of non-recyclable plastics something that goes away, because it's just bad for our planet. And so, looking at ways to increase recycling, invest in alternative materials have got to be part of that solution. And then again, individual responsibility. And even if it's something small, like saying, well, I always bring my bags to the grocery store. And it's a little thing, right? But it's a modeling to our children, to our neighbors, to our fellow shoppers, that I'm not going to use plastic bags in the store. When I lived out east, they instituted a penalty and you had to pay money. I think it was $0.05 per bag. And that actually had an impact. In Michigan, we voted to make it illegal to charge money for plastic bags, because we wanted to make sure we didn't take constructive, anyway, I just think that was a bad decision. Right? Anytime you give people a financial incentive to change, it works. So I think there are things that have been proven that work, but in the absence of them, let's model best practices in our homes, our own businesses, and our own congregations.
Thank you, Bryan. And no worries trying to get on that soapbox. Just let us know when and we'll schedule another one. I am one who goes on those soapboxes a lot. So thank you for your response. So just your closing remarks for us, Bryan, in just 60 seconds, what do you want our partners and constituents that tuned in tonight to know? What is that takeaway message you want to leave us with? And hopefully we would see how things go out and on November 3rd. So thank you for joining us, but your closing remarks, 60 seconds.
Well, again, just want to thank all of you for taking the time to spend with me and with us tonight. Thank you to the Climate Witness Project for raising this issue among the congressional candidates here in West Michigan. Again, I would just highlight some of the things I've already said, that, you know, it's my own upbringing as a person of faith. It's my own faith commitments that make my desire to care for creation and to be a good steward of our creation so important to me as an individual, but also so important to me as a candidate for Congress. And that I really do look forward to having the opportunity to represent West Michigan individuals and businesses and constituents. And I am ready to be a listening ear on this issue. I'm ready to be a vote in favor of taking immediate and decisive action on climate change, a vote to move us toward cleaner sources of energy, and a vote that I think reflects those faith commitments that God has entrusted his beautiful creation to all of us. Let's live up to that obligation by being good stewards in everything we do.
Thank you, Bryan. And we will also live up to our obligation to hold you accountable if you should win come November 3. We encourage all of you to look out for our follow-up email that has resources that point you into the direction of seeking climate justice and helping you to be an informed voter come November. Again, thank you so much for your time tonight, and thank you all for joining us. And we wrap up our series here in West Michigan. Thank you all, and have a good rest of your evening. See you all.
Thank you, everybody.